Hello, friends, and welcome back. Today, we'll be talking about Venus going into the sign of Virgo. So, we'll be talking about the current transit, which is a sign of its debilitation. And of course, it's corresponding to this whole eclipse season. And you know what? Excuse my language, fuck this eclipse season. It's been insane. I have not seen anything more bipolar than this eclipse season in Virgo right now. Some people are doing so well, like cool as a cucumber, and other people are just like, going insane. I'm amongst one of those people who are just like, going insane. My body's just been out of whack, but topic for another day. I made it here. I'm going to make this video. I'm determined. And when Venus goes into Virgo, we can say that all the signification of Venus starts to go through a very inhospitable environment because Venus is the planet of love. It wants to merge. It wants to create a sense of cohesion, coherence. It's about love and pleasure. So it's about merging, creating a union. On the other hand, Virgo loves to separate things, not in a conflictual way, but it wants to differentiate things so it can analyze them. It likes to classify and categorize. And that way it's able to define it and then refine it and then redo it again. In general, Virgo wants every detail to be accounted for. So in that sense, it's creating a separation through creating distinction. And in this way, we could say the sign of Virgo resists Venus's existential motion. So Venus is trying to merge and unify, and Virgo is saying, nope, I want this to be different than this and this and this and that. And as I mentioned, this is happening days before the eclipse, this ingress. And we'll walk through this, but Moon is also entering within a matter of minutes before Venus into the sign of Virgo. So we're going to be saying that there's going to be a lot of lessons of love, beauty, union, and pleasure, which are all going to be in a state of dis-ease. There's a sense of uneasiness about these topics. Venus's themes will be tested in a sense that Venus's signification is going to have to be purified, stripped down to their essence. And that's what we'll be exploring in this video today. And I'm going to walk you guys through the way I usually do the videos. So what does Venus in Virgo do, and then get into the transit. And as always, this video is timestamped, so if you guys just want to go straight to the transit, you can fast forward to there. But without further ado, let us begin. First of all, we can think of Venus's motion as convergence. It draws different parts together to establish a union. So it closes the gaps between things. And from that merging and connection, third variations can emerge from where Venus is, such as love, creations of beauty, or merely the sensation of pleasure. Venus is related to the five senses. So Venus's essence as a receptive planet is to dissolve separation and to create connections. Virgo, by contrast, which is an earth sign and it's a dual sign and is of the feminine principle, is also receptive, but it's deeply committed to distinction and classification. So it induces a type of separation. And that's because Virgo wants to refine things, and in order to do it, it needs to break things down. It wants to analyze, and to be able to do that, it needs to have an understanding of its details, to know how to order them and how to sort them. And this is where we have the core conflicts. Venus seeks to unify, Virgo seeks to distinguish. Venus wants to merge, Virgo wants to maintain the separated boundaries. And this is because Virgo wants to control the variable for correctness, efficiency, in order to make something pure. This is why Virgo is related to purity. Now, the question is, okay, that's Venus, that's Virgo. How is Venus going to play itself out? So let's go through some of the significations of Venus. For instance, when it comes to love, romance, unity, and cooperation, Venus flows towards harmonizing things. Virgo, on the other hand, will take what's been harmonized and dissect it to pieces, because it wants to understand, well, how was this harmony established? And by doing that, it naturally starts to scrutinize things, and it's able to find flaws within that thing. It can show how it's imperfect. And because of this, love that feels unconditional can suddenly become very conditional, because you can see the parts of its makeup. So, for example, Venus in Virgo people can have a tendency of using phrases like love is only worthy when, like this thing is worth loving only when it's right or correct. In a lot of ways, it's creating an anxiety about things that are not good enough yet. So it's replacing that accepting and abundant nature of Venus. So there's one contradiction. Then we have Venus symbolizing beauty, sensuality, and the five senses. And Venus can very much signify indulgence in the five senses. On the other hand, what does Virgo do? Virgo is managing the five senses because it wants to control the variables to be able to moderate them. So pleasure is always going to be tied to rules. For example, if you have a Venus by itself, it's like, I just want to eat for pleasure. It's soul food. It's feel-good food. Virgo is like, we got to diet. We got to restrict these calories, the macros, the micros, because it's about health, it's about staying pure. So when Venus goes into the sign of Virgo, it's indicating that enjoyment can now start to have these shadow sides or show its shadow sides, shadows of guilt specifically. Like enjoyment for its own sake doesn't make sense in the sign of Virgo. Venus is also a signification for fertility and sexual enjoyment. And it can also go on to the indulgent level with those things too. Virgo, on the other hand, is cautious, calculating, and it can even be timid sometimes. It's not shy, but there's a restrictive thing because it's just too aware of too many variables. So in Virgo, union, which relates to Venus, is filtered through rules. And there's this innate need that I need to manage my imperfections or the imperfections of my partner. Like sexual enjoyment can very much be filtered in ways that's just it's uncomfortable because, again, too many variables are at play. So Venus in Virgo can create a lot of sexual inhibition, a lot of hesitation, a lot of holding back. And that's because Virgo is thinking about 3 million things while having sex, where when you're having sex, you're just supposed to just be in the moment and enjoy it. Feel the pleasure. And lastly, Venus is of the feminine principle. So it's about receptivity and it's about cooperation. So Venus is about being open, the ability to receive. Virgo, on the other hand, has a tendency to actually do the opposite of this, even though it is a feminine sign. Again, it wants to narrow and analyze. And for this reason, Virgo is synonymous and famous for being fault-finding. Like it's receptive. It really wants to get to know you, but it just can't also help itself to understand you. That's part of its love language. Like, I'm really trying to understand what you're made of, why you do what you do. I'm so receptive to you. I'm so receptive that I'm even noticing the details. But it's like micro-analyzing it. And because of it, it has no choice but to find faults and flaws. And in this way, the way Virgo people are often received is that they're judgmental. Yes, they are judging in terms of assessing, but they're not necessarily judgmental if there's something else happening in their chart. But this is an uncomfortable thing for the planet Venus because it just wants to be receptive, connect, merge. It doesn't want to be dissected. So Venus's natural powers become fractured in the sign of Virgo. The Virgo environment constrains it a lot. So as you can see, all of these factors render Venus without having dignity in the sign of Virgo. It's debilitated. Venus doesn't have the power to be fully what it's about. It's like functions cannot be supported in what Virgo is operationalizing. In a lot of ways, love, beauty, and intimacy, which are related to Venus, instead of moving freely, become very conditional in the sign of Virgo. They can become anxious, conditional, dependent on perfection. So Venus's pleasure-seeking nature is redirected into service of correction. It's not for pleasure and harmony anymore. And this is what makes it problematic. And now with Virgo, Venus, what that all means away, let's move into the transit. It's actually a pretty complicated one when you look at it. And you would think this is not even related to the eclipses. What the hell? It's so far away from it. But there's just this narrative being weaved into the whole thing that is quite interesting, especially between Venus and Mercury, which is going to be ongoing till Mercury has its second kazimi in the sign of Scorpio. But let's get into how this whole story is getting weaved in together. So I want to take you guys back. While Venus was still in Leo, Mercury had its first kazimi with the sun, if you guys remember. So this was about the intellect, Mercury becoming illuminated while Mercury was sitting at the heart of the sun. It was absorbing its clarity, it was getting a sense of direction, a conscious purpose. Sun was saying to it, look, I just conjunct Ketu, and this is what's left of me here's what's left, go do something with it. I was explaining that in a previous video. And then shortly after that kazimi, Mercury moved into the sign of Libra, a sign of balance, justice, and relationships. And what's the paradox here? Well, who's the ruler of the sign of Libra, and who will be in the sign of Virgo pretty soon, debilitated with no dignity? You guessed it, Venus, that's going to be completely debilitated. So while Mercury is carrying the light of the sun into Libra, as soon as it comes to express itself, what the sun asked it to do, its host, its ruler, is compromised. So now that clarity of the message Mercury was carrying can risk being filtered through a lot of anxiety. So that's what we can expect. It feels a little too critiquey and fractured suddenly. Like, we had an idea on the 17th, like, yo, this is how I'm going to carry the message forward. And then there's like a little scramble in the air. Well, what am I supposed to do with this? So while Mercury is in a friend sign, the friend is not in a good shape to help Mercury out, which is Venus. So what we have to do is to be extremely aware, extremely diplomatic and tactful while Venus is in the sign of Virgo. And just to go back to Venus entering the sign of Virgo on the 19th, what happens is actually kind of bizarre. Okay, so 5 minutes before Venus enters into the sign of Virgo, the moon enters into the sign of Virgo. Well, that in itself is kind of cool, but what's the big deal? This year, we're going to have 2 new moon in the sign of Virgo. We already had a new moon at the beginning of Virgo season when the sun moved in, and then moon moved in at 0 degrees. We had that new moon. And what happened, what was also very different about that new moon and the sun being in the sign of Virgo, this is the first time we're having Uranus in the sign of Gemini. And it was squaring the moon and sun. That new moon was getting that Uranian effect, which was very uncomfortable. Now we're having this, it's almost like a repetition of that, but now this time with Venus. But let's go back to the moon for a second. The moon represents our mind, our emotions, our desires, and our internal rhythms, which gets into the sign of Virgo first. So you can see from that Uranus point, we're getting an interruption with all of these factors. So emotional instability, mental instability, suddenly feeling anxious are very much part and parcel with this moment. And it almost feels like to me, when I look at the chart visually, moon enters and is like, oh crap, there is K2. It's still 18 degrees apart. So it knows that it's going to have to go through some final act of detachment. But it's just kind of the moon's like, I'm exhausted, dude. Like, the mind is exhausted because the moon just came out of his full moon phase as an eclipse in the sign of Pisces because Rahu was sitting there completely destabilized. And now it's looking ahead and is like, crap, there's K2 and the eventual dissolving of it all, because that's a new moon we're talking about, right? Even by itself, it represents that. But now it's a solar eclipse on top of it. So it's almost like, to me, when I look at it, I'm like, the mind knows, even subconsciously, it knows what kind of crap it's walking into. And there's just a moment of panic as soon as you enter into Virgo. And of course, Venus, within a matter of minutes, enters right after the moon. You just kind of have to almost laugh at this one. And I say you have to laugh at this one because it's not just like it's following the mind, the moon. And Venus is like, oh my God. But Venus itself is also debilitated suddenly. So it's just unsettling. And we got that Uranus guy looking this way too, right? We could just say it's a very disorienting sign at that 0 degrees, especially when they both enter on the 19th. But now I just want us to take the mind, the moon, to that worst case scenario, which is the eclipse at 29 degrees. At this point, Venus is still in the initial degrees of Virgo, newly debilitated, and very far still from the eclipse. But it's important to remember that this eclipse is exactly opposite of Saturn retrograde in Pisces, because the eclipse and that new moon will be at 29 degrees. So we can, from that, also extract what Venus is going to be experiencing. And what that opposition is saying of the eclipse to Saturn has a lot to do with breakdown of expectations, the unraveling of cause and effect that we had previously conditioned in our mind in terms of this is how I do life. This is how I do my daily routine. This is how I do me. So there's a dissolution of what we thought was very much reliable in our life. It's a moment of truly seeing our limitation and just letting go. Be like, excuse my language, fuck it. I can't deal with this anymore. I'm done and done. And by virtue of Venus being in the sign where all of this is happening, it becomes part of this unraveling, which can be related to our relationship, our sense of value and worth, what's good, what's perfect, what's not. It's going to massive overanalysis. Instead of finding some comfort, some pleasure, someone to hug us, we're like overanalyzing the hug. So it's going to affect our capacity to feel a sense of pleasure and settlement and groundedness in that duration of time. And I want you to remember that Mercury is still in the sign of Libra, being very tactful and diplomatic. So our attempts at creating harmony will be tested. That's what this moment is saying, especially when we get close to the eclipse. But the silver lining here is this is a process of purification. This is like detox. We're learning what Venusian pleasures are healthy and unhealthy, for example, where we overindulge, where we harm ourselves. If it's in the house of others, how we harm others. Always look at where the sign of Virgo is falling, in which house. Is talking about the themes and the people of that house. Because we can't feel a sense of pleasure and yet forced to sort through things and analyze and overanalyze things. We're learning what's worth keeping and what it is that we need to let go. So now let's bring it all together by bringing Mercury back into this. So as I said, Mercury is carrying the message of the sun. Poor little guy. He has so much on his shoulders. But now the ruler of its sign, Libra, is debilitated. The Venus is debilitated. So we're being tactful through emotional exhaustion, through an icky feeling of I have zero pleasure in my life. Like Mercury is trying to connect everything and everybody. And then in our head, we're thinking, well, there has to be some conditions to love. What do you mean? This is unconditional love. I can't love you like this. I can't do relationships like this. And Mercury's like, let's just be tactful. So there's just this anxious feeling to love, connection, relationships, our own routines, how we fit into our lives. In some way, the shadow moment of this transit, if we really look at it, we're seeking for perfection. We want things to be perfect. That's why everything's glitching the hell out right now. So let's just go through some life lessons to understand how to overcome these glitches and what we can actually extract that's positive or at least productive with this transit. Okay, challenge number 1 is related to themes of union versus separation. And as I mentioned earlier, Venus wants convergence, merging, beauty, and union. Virgo wants analysis, separation, and perfection. So this tension can fracture love into conditions. For example, I'll love you when it's right, when it's pure, when it's fixed, when you fix yourself, or when I fix myself, then I can love. You know, you hear this a lot, especially in our time, men and the pressure that they have on them. They'll say, well, I can't be in a relationship until I'm financially established and rich. And that's what a man does. This is like, I got to fix myself, right? We're going to these kinds of themes. The lesson here is true union doesn't come from perfection. It comes from presence. Love isn't about some flawless order that we have to establish. It's about resonance and acceptance, despite all the imperfections. As the vows go, for better and for worse, richer and poor, till death do us apart. It's talking about the imperfections of life, and there's acceptance, and we move through it. So not looking for perfection, key during this transit. Challenge number 2 is related to purity versus pleasure. And as I said, Venus wants sensual enjoyment and abundance of senses. Virgo, on the other hand, wants restraint, prudence, purity, and cleanliness. So the body and its senses, its need for pleasure can be over-scrutinized. It can even be denied and restricted because you want to control the variables, because you want to be healthy, because that's what you're telling yourself the perfect picture of the self and the future looks like. But the lesson here is to reclaim joy in the senses, letting oneself be and not get anxious about it, and become an observer of it, so where you're doing too much, too little. Purity is actually not achieved through denying pleasure. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make. It's about discerning the kind of pleasure that's actually life-promoting, life-generating, and life-giving. When you're healthy, when your body is healthy, there's a sense of joy and pleasure. So there's a sense of wellness and health. To constantly restrict it to control all the variables, and you feel that the sense of pleasure being extracted from your life, that's actually a sensation, is an indicator that you're doing something wrong. That's not the balance. And we might go to these extremes during this transit, and it's something to learn from. Our aim should be to align with what actually brings pleasure, and from that, a sense of joy. Challenge number 3. It's very much related to relational anxiety versus cooperation. So Venus naturally harmonizes and creates cooperation. But in Virgo, this process that Venus goes through becomes a bit timid. It starts to doubt itself. It can become self-conscious, self-critiquing, self-analyzing. So relationships feel like they need endless fixing. I either need to fix the other person or I need to fix myself. Because Virgo is like a math book full of problems that you just need to sit down and solve. And everyone and everything is a math book full of problems that you need to solve. But the lesson here is not to see cooperation as perfect agreement, but as a living process of relating. Like, unity is not born out of endless critique of things until things are right. It's about the willingness to meet the other person where they are. And you know what? In that process, you're doing the Virgo thing. Because if the person that you are with, they are not perfect and you can't have your perfection and you can't fix them, you have to sacrifice, put yourself at the service of the other person, which is again going back to that Virgo function, so things can actually work out. So we don't need perfect agreement. We just have to be a willing participant. Challenge number 4 can be very much related to conditional love. And I want you to remember that situation with Moon and Venus. Moon represents our emotions too, right? A very destabilized mind and emotion and internal rhythms, and a debilitated Venus in the sign of Virgo. It can create very over-exaggerated mental imagery or sensations and feelings about our attachments. And I would argue that one of the lessons here with the condition of the Moon and Venus here is to just release the obsession with controlling love. And for other people, it might be beauty, because Venus also represents cosmetics and how we look. Beautiful things in general, luxurious things. To let go of the perfect imagery or the perfect need, the Moon represents needs, for perfection of how things ought to look or perfect unions, and to really try to understand what it means to embrace the deeper values of sincerity, humility, and care. And it's this that's going to allow Mercury in the sign of Libra to carry the message of the King, the Sun, the Self forward into the future after the kazimi and the eclipse. And when we do consider Mercury, we come to challenge number 5, which is about compromise. And this is because of Mercury's connection to Venus in the sign of Virgo, which is Mercury's sign. They're doing an exchange, right? Mercury's in Venus's sign, Venus is in Mercury's sign. This aspect of it can actually become very much about justice and fairness and relationships. And this is because Venus is in the sign of Virgo and because it's debilitated. We can constantly grapple between what qualifies as cooperation versus judgment, critique, or just expression of relational disappointment. And I think that the lesson here is to refine our speech and our thinking process to the degree that we're able to, so that our sense of clarity is not lost in criticism. To learn how to speak our truth, what we don't like, what bothers us, what makes us anxious, with tact, with care, with consideration. Our objective should be right now, how do we allow Mercury to preserve the light of the soul, the message, which is essentially about how do we maintain our own integrity, and in the sign of Libra, the integrity of others, even when relational dynamics are imperfect. So in other words, how do we maintain our own and others' dignity and not just reduce them to a bunch of faults or become that person for another person to please them? And just to close off, this video went a little bit longer than I was anticipating. I would say that in general, the larger life lesson of this transit and this cycle of Venus is that love and beauty don't need perfection to exist. That discomfort itself is teaching us something very profound, especially after the eclipses, that's been demanding us to reset and to do things in a new way. In fact, we could say Venus in Virgo teaches that urge to purify, correct, and perfect unions must eventually yield to the simple fact of connection itself. And the eclipse itself is setting up the stage for this. A lot of people will have their love life and their relationship tested at this time to see where love is conditional, where it's perfectionistic intimacy, where it's anxious connections, attachments, anxious pleasures. All these things are going to be tested. They want to be stripped down. They want to be purified. Something new wants to come into this place. And to have the two most feely planets involved in this, Moon and Venus, we're supposed to feel it. How else will we know it? We give too much credit to our thinking process that we can think through everything. But sometimes we need to feel the moon and sense Venus in order to understand. And before closing this video, if you like the content of this video, please do remember to like, subscribe, and comment. You'll be helping me a lot. And you guys know I love your comments. And for my readings, you can go to the description box below or to parisayazzi.com. And I'll leave you with this. As Venus moves through Virgo and as this eclipse season unfolds, my wish for all of us is to not let perfection rob us of love. May we learn how to find beauty in what's unfinished, grace in what is flawed, and even connection when all the pieces don't fit together. And I say that because love doesn't wait for purity. It grows in the soils of acceptance and what is real. And that's exactly what Saturn will be reminding us and reminding Venus by the end of its journey in Virgo, because Venus will have to come to opposition with that Saturn also. And may this time guide all of us to see that the most sincere unions are not perfect, but alive. That's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.